Ethan Carter learned early that being the smartest person in the room meant nothing if the people in power refused to hear your voice. At 32, he was the operations strategist behind nearly every major success at Langford Biotech, a fast-rising pharmaceutical company that prided itself on innovation while quietly running on the work of people it never intended to reward. Ethan was the one who fixed broken systems, rebuilt failing departments, and saved contracts that senior executives nearly destroyed through bad decisions. But whenever the praise came, his name disappeared. His work was presented by others. His ideas were repeated by executives who had mocked them weeks before. His strategies drove the company forward, yet he remained invisible, useful enough to exploit, but never respected enough to promote. The worst of them all was Victoria Langford, the CEO's daughter and the company's golden executive. She had inherited her title, her office, and her arrogance. To her, Ethan was not a rising leader. He was just a man behind the curtain, someone brilliant enough to solve problems but not polished enough, connected enough, or born into the right family to deserve authority. "Keep him where he is," Ethan once overheard her say through the half-open conference room door. "He's valuable, but he's not leadership material." Those words stayed with him. Not because they hurt, but because they confirmed what he had begun to suspect. No matter how much he achieved, no matter how much value he created, they would never let him rise. Ethan sat at his desk one Friday afternoon reviewing projections for a major expansion deal he had personally spent 6 months building. It was his strategy, his financial model, his market analysis, his framework. He had prepared everything. Then his assistant walked by and asked casually, "Aren't you heading to the boardroom?" Ethan frowned. "What boardroom?" She blinked. "The executive meeting. About the expansion plan." His stomach dropped. He stood immediately and walked toward the glass conference room overlooking the city skyline. Through the transparent walls, he saw them all seated inside. Victoria Langford, Richard Monroe, Jonathan Whitmore, and every senior executive discussing his strategy without him. His slides were on the screen. His charts. His words. But his chair was empty because there had never been one reserved for him. Ethan stood outside the door for 3 long seconds, staring at the people who had built careers by stepping on his work. Then Victoria noticed him. She walked to the door, opened it slightly, and gave him a cold smile. "This is executive-level discussion, Ethan," she said softly. "We'll let you know if we need technical clarification." Then she shut the door in his face. That moment changed everything. Ethan returned to his desk, sat down in silence, and stared at the city lights outside his office window. The anger came first. Then humiliation. Then clarity. They had shut him out on purpose. They wanted his mind, his labor, and his results, but never his seat at the table. Never his authority. Never his recognition. That night, Ethan stopped being loyal to people who saw him as disposable. He stopped trying to prove himself to executives who profited from underestimating him. He stopped asking for opportunities that were never going to be given. Instead, he made a decision that would change every power structure in that building. If they refused to let him rise inside their system, he would build power above it. Over the following weeks, Ethan transformed in silence. He did his job flawlessly, as always, but behind the scenes, he began moving strategically. He networked with board members who had quietly admired his results. He enrolled in executive certification programs the company had once denied him funding for. He attended investor dinners where Victoria assumed he did not belong. He made allies among stakeholders who cared more about competence than family legacy. And for the first time, people at the highest levels began noticing what the company had buried. Ethan Carter was not simply a skilled employee. He was leadership. He was vision. He was the reason half the company's success existed in the first place. Meanwhile, the executives who had shut him out remained blind. They mistook his silence for defeat. They thought the lack of argument meant submission. Richard Monroe joked in meetings that Ethan had finally learned his place. Victoria barely looked at him anymore unless she needed a crisis solved. They had no idea he was becoming the most respected rising authority in rooms they had never been invited into. Then came the email that shook the company. The founder and chairman announced an emergency restructuring after investor dissatisfaction and operational concerns. A new strategic governance division would be created to oversee all major corporate initiatives, acquisitions, and expansion approvals. Every executive project moving forward would require final authorization from the newly appointed Director of Strategic Governance. And when the appointment was announced, the entire building went silent. Ethan Carter. Victoria stormed into the chairman's office demanding an explanation. Richard Monroe nearly dropped his phone. Jonathan Whitmore reportedly cursed loud enough for 3 departments to hear. But none of it mattered. Because in a single moment, the man they had excluded from the room had become the reason the room could no longer function without him. Ethan walked into his new office on the top executive floor the following Monday wearing the same calm expression he always had. The difference was that now the people who once ignored him stood when he entered. Assistants addressed him with deference. Board members greeted him as an equal. And for the first time in company history, Victoria Langford had to schedule a meeting to enter his office. She sat across from him that afternoon, her jaw tight with forced politeness, sliding a folder across his desk. "We need approval for the expansion plan," she said. Ethan opened the folder slowly. It was the same plan they had discussed behind closed doors without him. His plan. His strategy. His vision. He looked up at her with calm eyes and asked, "Need technical clarification?" Her face drained of color. Ethan closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. "I'll review it when I have time." In that moment, Victoria understood the truth. The man they had treated as invisible was now the gatekeeper of their future. The employee they had shut out had become their final authority. And this was only the beginning. If you're enjoying this story so far, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and comment where you're watching from. Because what happened next made the entire company realize that underestimating the wrong person comes with a price. The day Ethan Carter became Director of Strategic Governance, the atmosphere inside Langford Biotech changed overnight. People who once walked past him without a greeting now straightened their backs when he entered a room. Managers who had ignored his emails suddenly replied within minutes. Executives who had built careers pretending he did not matter now watched every move he made with nervous eyes. But Ethan did not celebrate. He did not brag. He did not seek revenge with loud speeches or petty insults. He understood something his enemies never had: real power did not need to announce itself. It simply existed, and everyone felt it. For years, Ethan had been the invisible engine behind the company's success. Now that same company had placed him in a role where no major decision moved forward without his approval. Every acquisition, every budget increase, every expansion proposal, every strategic partnership now crossed his desk first. And that reality was unbearable for the people who had spent years shutting him out. Victoria Langford was the first to test him. 3 days after his appointment, she marched into his office with Richard Monroe and a polished presentation for the European expansion project, the same project they had excluded him from weeks earlier. She spoke with forced confidence, pretending their history had never happened. "We're ready for approval," she said, sliding the proposal across his desk. Ethan opened the file and began reading in silence. The room grew tense. Richard shifted in his seat. Victoria crossed her arms, trying to maintain control. Ethan turned one page. Then another. Then another. Finally, he closed the folder and placed it neatly on his desk. "Denied," he said. The word hit like a hammer. Victoria blinked. "Excuse me." Ethan folded his hands calmly. "Your risk analysis is incomplete. Supply chain projections are inflated. Legal exposure in 2 territories is underestimated. Financial assumptions are unrealistic. This proposal is not ready." Richard leaned forward. "That can be fixed after launch." Ethan's eyes moved to him slowly. "No. It should have been fixed before it reached me. Victoria's face hardened. This project has executive backing. Ethan nodded once. And now it needs my approval. It doesn't have it. The silence that followed was suffocating. Victoria stood abruptly, grabbed the folder, and stormed out with Richard behind her. That afternoon, the story spread through the company like wildfire. Ethan Carter had denied Victoria Langford's flagship project on his first week in power. Employees whispered in hallways. Managers exchanged stunned glances. For the first time, the golden executive had been publicly challenged, and she had lost. But Ethan was not playing games. He was not acting out of bitterness. He was doing what no one else had done before, enforcing standards. For years, executives had rushed reckless ideas through the company because no one had the authority or courage to stop them. Ethan changed that immediately. If a proposal was weak, he rejected it. If numbers were manipulated, he exposed it. If executives tried to bypass policy, he shut it down. He became known throughout the building as fair, ruthless, and impossible to manipulate. Some feared him. Others admired him. But everyone respected him. And the more he enforced excellence, the more one truth became impossible to ignore: Langford Biotech had never run this efficiently before Ethan took control. Costs dropped. Failed initiatives declined. Investor confidence rose. Departments became more disciplined because they knew shortcuts would no longer survive. Within months, the company's profits surged. The board praised Ethan openly. Industry analysts credited the company's turnaround to the new governance structure. And for the first time, Victoria's influence began to fade. She hated every second of it. She tried everything to regain control. She attempted charm first, inviting Ethan to executive dinners and pretending old tensions no longer existed. He declined politely. She tried flattery, praising his leadership in public meetings. He ignored it. She tried subtle guilt, reminding him that the company is one team. He answered only with results. Then, when manipulation failed, she turned desperate. One afternoon she entered his office alone, closed the door behind her, and dropped all pretense. "How long are you going to do this?" she asked coldly. Ethan looked up from his desk. "Do what?" "Punish us." He almost smiled. "You think this is punishment? You've made everyone afraid of you." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "No, Victoria. I made them accountable." Her voice sharpened. "You enjoying this?" "Enjoying what?" Ethan asked. "Doing the job your father should have hired someone competent enough to do years ago." Her face went pale. "Careful." Ethan stood slowly, meeting her eye to eye for the first time, not as subordinate to superior, but as equal to equal. "No, Victoria. You be careful. For years you treated competence like a threat because it exposed your weakness. You shut me out because you thought authority belonged to whoever inherited the title. You were wrong. Authority belongs to the person capable of carrying it." She stared at him, speechless. Ethan stepped closer, voice calm and controlled. "I am not punishing you. I am simply doing what you never expected me to do, holding you to the same standard you held everyone else to." Victoria left without another word, but the damage was done. She knew then what everyone else had already realized: Ethan was not temporary. He was not symbolic. He was not a political appointment. He was the most powerful operational force in the company, and he had earned every inch of it. Soon, even outside the company, Ethan's reputation exploded. Investors requested him by name in strategy meetings. Partner firms insisted he oversee negotiations personally. Industry publications began mentioning him as the architect behind Langford Biotech's transformation. The once overlooked strategist had become the face of executive discipline and corporate success. Yet Ethan never forgot where he came from. He remembered every meeting he had been excluded from. Every idea stolen. Every insult disguised as feedback. Every time they called him valuable but not leadership material. Those memories did not make him cruel. They made him precise. He never sought revenge through chaos. He sought it through excellence. Through becoming so undeniable that the people who once dismissed him had no choice but to stand beneath the authority they tried to deny him. And then came the announcement that changed everything again. The board scheduled a private meeting with Ethan and informed him of a confidential plan. The chairman intended to step back from active control, and they wanted Ethan to help identify the company's next long-term leader. Ethan nodded professionally, but inside he understood the true meaning instantly. The board was no longer asking him to approve strategy. They were asking him to shape the future of the entire company. And for the first time, Victoria Langford realized her greatest fear was no longer losing arguments to Ethan Carter. It was the possibility that the man she once shut out might soon become the one sitting in the chair she believed was hers by birthright. The private board meeting should have been the proudest moment of Ethan Carter's career, yet as he walked out of the chairman's office that evening, he knew it marked the beginning of something far more dangerous than a promotion. The board no longer saw him as merely the company's strategic authority. They saw him as the future. And in a building filled with ambitious executives, inherited privilege, and fragile egos, that kind of recognition was not just power, it was a threat. Word spread quickly, even though the board had intended the discussion to remain confidential. In companies like Langford Biotech, secrets never stayed hidden for long. By the next morning, whispers were moving through every department. Ethan Carter was being considered for succession planning. Ethan Carter had the board's trust. Ethan Carter might one day become CEO. And with every whisper, Victoria Langford's expression darkened. She had spent her entire adult life believing the company would eventually belong to her. Not because she had earned it, but because she had been born into it. To her, leadership was inheritance, not merit. Ethan's rise was more than an inconvenience, it was an insult to everything she believed about her place in the world. She could tolerate him as a temporary authority. She could endure him as a gatekeeper. But the thought of Ethan Carter becoming the man above her was unbearable. That was when the sabotage began. At first it was subtle. Budget reports Ethan needed went missing before major meetings. Internal memos were delayed. Executives suddenly forgot to copy him on key correspondence. Rumors began circulating that Ethan was overreaching, that he was power-hungry, that he was using his position to settle personal scores. It was the kind of quiet political warfare corporate offices specialized in, clean enough to deny, poisonous enough to damage reputations. But Ethan had expected it. People who lost power rarely surrendered gracefully. He responded the only way he knew how, with discipline. He documented everything. Every missing report. Every altered timeline. Every false rumor. Every bypass attempt. He said nothing publicly. He simply collected evidence while continuing to outperform everyone around him. Then came the quarterly executive summit, the company's most important internal presentation of the year. Investors, board members, senior leadership, and strategic partners filled the auditorium. Victoria Langford was scheduled to present her ambitious acquisition proposal, a multi-million-dollar expansion she believed would restore her standing and prove she deserved future leadership. She had spent weeks preparing for it. The room buzzed with anticipation as she stepped onto the stage, polished and confident. Her presentation began smoothly. Market forecasts, projected growth, strategic alignment, it was everything an investor wanted to hear. Then one board member raised his hand. "Before we proceed," he said, "Mr. Carter, as Director of Strategic Governance, have you approved this acquisition?" Every eye turned toward Ethan. Victoria froze. Ethan stood slowly from his seat. The silence became electric. He held a thin folder in one hand. "No," he said calmly. Murmurs rippled across the room. Victoria's face tightened. "The review is still in progress," she said quickly. Ethan turned toward her, voice measured. "No, Victoria. The review concluded this morning." He opened the folder. And after examining the financial exposure, legal liabilities, and manipulated growth assumptions in this proposal. I formally rejected it. The room erupted into whispers. Victoria's composure cracked. That is not accurate. Ethan raised a hand. Page 17 includes inflated market projections unsupported by current data. Page 23 omits litigation risk in the target company's pending disputes. Page 31 reclassifies debt as operational investment to conceal leverage exposure. He placed the folder on the table. Would you like me to continue? Her face drained of color. The board stared at her in disbelief. Investors looked furious. Executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Ethan had not just rejected her proposal, he had dismantled it publicly, with evidence. Victoria tried to recover. These were preliminary estimates. No, Ethan interrupted. These were deliberate misrepresentations presented to influence board approval. The chairman's expression turned ice cold. Miss Langford, he said sharply, my office. Immediately after this session. Victoria stood frozen, humiliated before the most powerful people in the company. Then she walked off the stage without another word. That moment changed everything. Within days, the board launched an internal review into executive misconduct. Several of Victoria's closest allies were implicated for approving misleading financial assumptions and bypassing governance procedures. Richard Monroe resigned before the inquiry concluded. Jonathan Whitmore was removed from strategic oversight entirely. And Victoria, once untouchable, once treated like inevitable leadership, was stripped of major authority pending investigation. For the first time in company history, the Langford name no longer guaranteed protection. Ethan had not attacked them. He had simply forced the truth into the light. Employees across the company watched in awe. The same executives who once mocked Ethan now avoided eye contact in hallways. Junior staff whispered about him like a legend. To many, he had become more than an executive, he had become proof that competence could defeat corruption. That merit could defeat nepotism. That real authority came from ability, not title. But Ethan knew the fight was not over. Public humiliation made people dangerous. Cornered people did reckless things. And Victoria Langford was now more desperate than ever. 2 nights later, Ethan returned to his office after a late investor call and found Victoria waiting inside, sitting in the dark beside his desk. She stood when he entered. Her face was stripped of arrogance now, replaced by something colder, rage mixed with desperation. You planned this, she said. Ethan closed the door behind him. No. You planned your own downfall. I just refused to protect you from it. She stepped closer. You think you've won? Ethan met her gaze calmly. No. I think you still don't understand why you lost. Her voice trembled. This company was supposed to be mine. Ethan's reply came like steel. That was your first mistake, thinking ownership is inherited while leadership is earned. She stared at him, speechless. He stepped forward, voice low and controlled. You spent years treating competent people like threats instead of assets. You shut out everyone who challenged your ego. You believed authority was a birthright. But power doesn't stay with the person who wants it most. It stays with the person who proves worthy of it. Tears of anger burned in her eyes, but she said nothing. Because deep down, she knew he was right. She turned and walked out without another word. Ethan stood alone in the office, looking over the city skyline through the glass walls. Below him stretched the company he had once served in silence, now transformed by the standards he had enforced. The same building where he had once been shut out of meetings now revolved around his decisions. The same people who once stole his work now feared disappointing him. And just when it seemed his rise had reached its peak, the chairman called him the next morning with words that would change everything forever. Ethan, he said, the board has reached a decision. We want you to prepare for the next stage of leadership. Ethan's hand tightened on the phone. The war for authority was no longer about influence. It was now about succession. And if you're enjoying this story so far, subscribe, like the story, and stay with me. because what happened next would force the entire company to choose between legacy and merit, and only one could survive. The morning after the chairman's call, Ethan Carter arrived at Langford Biotech knowing the balance of power inside the company had shifted again. The board's message had been clear: they were no longer preparing him for a bigger operational role, they were preparing him for succession. Not publicly, not yet, but inside the highest level of leadership, the conversation had already begun. Ethan Carter was now the leading candidate to become the future CEO of the company that once treated him like he did not belong in the room. For most people, that kind of victory would have felt like the finish line. For Ethan, it felt like entering the final round of a war he knew was not over. Because while competence had earned him power, it had also made him the most dangerous threat to everyone who benefited from the old system. And desperate people rarely accepted defeat quietly. The backlash came fast. Anonymous complaints were filed accusing Ethan of creating a hostile executive culture. Selective leaks reached industry blogs claiming he ruled through fear and intimidation. Former allies of Victoria Langford suddenly reappeared, trying to frame Ethan as a cold opportunist who had manipulated the board for personal gain. But the attacks did not stick. The numbers protected him. Under Ethan's leadership, company profits had climbed higher than at any point in the previous 5 years. Investor trust was stronger. Strategic losses had fallen. Employee retention had improved. Departments that once operated through politics now functioned through accountability. No rumor could compete with measurable results. That only made his enemies more desperate. One afternoon, Ethan was called into a closed-door board meeting. The chairman sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. Beside him were the board members who had quietly supported Ethan's rise. Across from them sat Victoria Langford, composed again, polished again, but with the brittle calm of someone fighting for survival. The chairman folded his hands. "We are here to discuss the future leadership structure of Langford Biotech." The room went still. Victoria straightened in her chair. Ethan remained expressionless. One board member spoke first. "Miss Langford has requested consideration for interim executive succession review." Ethan almost smiled. Victoria had not come to accept defeat. She had come to demand one last chance. The chairman nodded toward her. "Make your case." Victoria stood and delivered the speech of her life. She spoke about legacy, family stewardship, public perception, continuity of leadership, the importance of the Langford name. She framed herself as the natural successor, the public face of the company, the heir to its history. She spoke with confidence, with polish, with every ounce of charm she had left. Then she sat down and looked at Ethan as if daring him to respond. The chairman turned. "Mr. Carter." Ethan stood slowly. He did not carry notes. He did not open slides. He simply looked around the room and spoke plainly. Leadership is not legacy. It is responsibility. Silence fell immediately. A company this size cannot be handed to someone because of bloodline, title, or expectation. It must be entrusted to the person most capable of protecting its future. He turned toward the board. In the past 18 months, under governance reform, this company has reduced strategic losses by 37%, increased investor confidence by 22%, and delivered the strongest operating margin in company history. Then he looked directly at Victoria. That did not happen because of inheritance. It happened because standards replaced entitlement. Her face hardened. Ethan's voice remained calm. "If this board believes someone else can lead better than I can, I will support that decision without complaint. But if leadership is being decided by merit, results, and accountability, then the answer is obvious." He sat down. No one spoke for several seconds. Then one board member began clapping softly. Another joined. Then another. Victoria stared in disbelief as the room that had once protected her turned toward Ethan with visible approval. She understood in that moment what she had feared for months: the board had already chosen. The meeting ended without a formal announcement, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Within days, the company prepared for public transition planning. Ethan's elevation would be announced after final regulatory and shareholder approval. News leaked quickly through the building. Employees celebrated quietly. Executives who once dismissed him scrambled to secure favor. Department heads suddenly treated him like a future king. Yet Ethan remained unchanged. He continued his work with the same discipline, the same professionalism, the same refusal to indulge in arrogance. That restraint only increased the respect people had for him. But Victoria was not done. 2 nights before the official announcement, she requested one final private meeting. Ethan agreed. She entered his office after hours wearing none of her usual executive confidence. No polished smile. No practiced arrogance. Just exhaustion. She sat across from him and spoke quietly. "Do you know what hurts the most?" Ethan said nothing. She gave a bitter laugh. "It's not losing the position. It's knowing you deserved it more than I ever did." Ethan studied her carefully. It was the first honest thing she had ever said to him. "Then why fight it?" he asked. Her eyes lowered. "Because admitting that means admitting my whole life was built on something I didn't earn." The room fell silent. Ethan leaned forward. "Then earn what comes next." She looked up, surprised. "You still think I can stay here after everything?" "That depends," Ethan said. "Do you want power, or do you want to become worthy of it?" She had no answer. She stood slowly, nodded once, and left. It was not redemption. Not yet. But for the first time, she had faced the truth. The next morning, the company auditorium filled to capacity. Staff crowded balconies and lined walls. Executives took front row seats. Investors watched remotely. The chairman stepped onto the stage and delivered the announcement the entire company had been waiting for. Effective immediately, Ethan Carter is appointed Chief Executive Officer of Langford Biotech. The room exploded into applause. Some stood instantly. Others cheered openly. Ethan walked to the stage in measured steps, his expression calm, but inside he felt the weight of every moment that had brought him there. Every insult, every exclusion, every stolen idea, every door closed in his face. He took the podium and looked out over the company that had once shut him out. "Many of you know my story," he said. "Some of you know only the ending. But I want to be clear about something. This is not a story about revenge. It is a story about standards. About what happens when competence refuses to stay silent. About what happens when leadership is earned, not inherited." The applause thundered again. Ethan looked toward the front row, where Victoria sat in silence. Their eyes met briefly. No hatred remained. Only understanding. He had not destroyed her. He had surpassed her. And if you're enjoying this story, subscribe, like the story, and stay to the end, because the final chapter reveals what Ethan did next with the power they never thought he would have. Becoming CEO of Langford Biotech should have felt like the end of Ethan Carter's journey, but as he stood alone in the executive office that once belonged to men and women who had dismissed him, he understood something important. Power was never the reward. Power was the responsibility. The real test was not whether he could rise above the people who shut him out. The real test was what kind of leader he would become now that no one stood above him. The company celebrated his appointment for weeks. Investors praised the board's decision. Industry media called his rise one of the most remarkable leadership stories in corporate history. Employees who had once worked in fear under incompetent executives now felt hopeful for the first time in years. But Ethan did not waste time enjoying praise. On his first day as CEO, he called a company-wide leadership summit and delivered a message no one expected. "This company will no longer reward politics over performance," he said from the stage. "Titles will not protect failure. Relationships will not excuse incompetence. And no employee, at any level, will ever again be shut out because someone in power feels threatened by their talent." The room erupted into applause. For many employees, those words were more than policy. They were justice. Ethan immediately began restructuring the company from the top down. Executive promotions were tied to measurable results instead of internal favoritism. Anonymous employee reviews were introduced to expose abusive management. Cross-department mentorship programs were launched so overlooked talent could be identified early. Leadership development opportunities were open to every high performer, not just the politically connected. Within months, the culture of the company transformed. Productivity soared. Innovation increased. Employees who had once kept their heads down now stepped forward with ideas because they believed merit mattered. Ethan had not simply taken power, he had changed the rules of the system that once excluded him. Yet his greatest test came when he had to decide the future of the people who had tried hardest to keep him down. Richard Monroe requested a meeting first. The former executive who once laughed at Ethan's place in the company now sat nervously across from him in a smaller office, no longer protected by title or influence. "I know I was wrong about you," Richard admitted. "I underestimated you." Ethan leaned back calmly. "Yes. You did." Richard swallowed. "I'm asking for another chance." Ethan looked at him for a long moment before speaking. Being wrong about someone is not the problem. Refusing to learn from it is. He slid a document across the table. "You'll be reassigned to regional operations. Lower authority. Performance-based review after 12 months. Earn your way back if you can." Richard stared at the paper in stunned silence. Ethan had every reason to destroy him completely. Instead, he gave him what no one had given Ethan, a chance to prove himself by merit. Then came Victoria Langford. She entered his office weeks later, no longer as rival, not even as challenger, but as a woman standing in the ruins of her own entitlement. "I heard what you did for Richard," she said. Ethan nodded. He asked for a second chance. "And if I asked for one," she said quietly. Ethan studied her. "Do you want a second chance because you lost power, or because you understand why you lost it?" She held his gaze for several seconds. "Because I understand now." Ethan believed her. Not fully. Not blindly. But enough to test it. "Then here is your chance," he said. "You will remain with the company in strategic development. No executive privilege. No title inheritance. No special treatment. You will build your future the same way everyone else does, by earning it." Victoria exhaled slowly, emotion flickering across her face. She nodded once. "Fair enough." As she left his office, Ethan realized the final victory was not humiliating those who wronged him. It was becoming powerful enough to choose fairness when revenge would have been easier. Years passed, and under Ethan's leadership, Langford Biotech became stronger than ever. Revenue doubled. Global expansion succeeded. Employee satisfaction reached record highs. The company became known not just for innovation, but for leadership excellence. Business schools studied its transformation. Industry conferences invited Ethan to speak about strategic reform, power reversal, and building systems where competence could thrive. But the moment Ethan cherished most did not happen in a boardroom or on a stage. It happened late one evening when a young analyst knocked on his office door. Nervous, uncertain, carrying a presentation folder with shaking hands. "Sir," she said, "I know I'm junior, but I think I found a flaw in the expansion proposal for next quarter." Ethan looked at her for a moment, then smiled and gestured toward the chair in front of his desk. "Sit down," he said. "Let's hear it." She sat, relief flooding her face, and began explaining her analysis. As Ethan listened, he felt something deeper than pride. He felt closure. Because years earlier, he had stood outside a closed boardroom door while people less capable than him decided he did not belong inside. Now he was the man holding the door open for others. The man who once had no seat at the table had built a longer table instead. Months later, during the annual shareholder gala, Ethan stood at the podium as CEO and looked across the room filled with executives, employees, investors, and guests. Among them sat Victoria, now respected for work she had finally earned. Richard, rebuilt through accountability. And dozens of rising employees who knew their futures would be decided by performance, not politics. Ethan raised his glass and delivered the words that became legend inside the company. They once shut me out because they feared what I could become. In the end, I became the reason they needed approval. But true success was never making them kneel. It was building something better than what they tried to keep from me. The room stood in applause. Ethan smiled, not because he had won, but because he had proven the one truth his entire journey had taught him. When people underestimate you, exclude you, and deny your worth, the greatest revenge is not anger. It is becoming undeniable. It is rising so high that the same people who shut the door must one day stand before you asking for entry. And if this story inspired you, subscribe, comment where you are watching from, like the story, and remember, sometimes being shut out is exactly what pushes you to become the one they can never ignore again.